This is Dr. Mark Hitchcock welcoming you to another episode of Marking the Times. As usual, I'm here in my office at Faith Bible Church in Edmond, Oklahoma, and it's great to have you with us on Marking the Times. I appreciate you taking time to watch this video blog, and you can send in questions to the Facebook page. Sometimes I get around to answering some of the questions you send in, and I would like to just talk about issues in our world today. They're related to Bible prophecy, and just how the stage is being set today for the coming of Jesus Christ. You know, one thing I get asked about a lot these days, and I really think about a lot in my own life, is just how you and I as believers respond in a culture today that is dramatically changing. There's no doubt about it that our culture is changing, and the change is dramatic and it's sudden. And I think one of the reasons we feel it so much in our culture is largely in American history, our country's been sheltered and shielded really from any kind of persecution for our Christian belief. In fact, we were the majority really in the country. And I'm not saying the majority of people were necessarily Christians or believers in Christ, but there was just kind of this overall environment that was accepting of Christianity and very positive towards it. But as we all know, there's been a massive cultural shift in our country in the last couple of decades, really even just in the last few years. The winds of change are blowing. And we all see it, we all feel it, I think, very, very greatly. We're more and more today, we're the master's minority. And we're kind of the piñatas of society, really, today. Christians are, and those who hold the Christian beliefs and principles. And, you and I often ask the question, well, what do we do in a time like this? What should we be doing as believers in Jesus Christ? Some people are, morose and bitter about what's happening. Other people are lashing out at the culture. What do we do biblically to respond to times like these? Well, the New Testament tells us over and over again to expect opposition and persecution. And I can't think of a better place to go in the Bible than 1 Peter. Because really the situation that the audience in 1 Peter was facing is pretty similar to what we face in America today. I mean, it wasn't persecution in the sense of people being martyred or killed for their faith, or even being physically beaten for their faith. But it was the idea of being mocked and ridiculed and slandered and maligned. I kind of call it a soft persecution or a low-grade persecution. Now, eventually this soft persecution in our country and this low-grade persecution, I think, is going to ratchet up over time into increasing levels of persecution against us as God's people. But in 1 Peter 4, verses 12 to 19, and I'm just going to touch on this real briefly, but you might want to read this on your own. We're told 4 things that we can do, 4 ways we should respond as this low-grade persecution is upon us that may be, again, ramping up to a greater form of it. In chapter 4, verse 12, Peter wrote this, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you." I think the first thing we need is a good dose of realism. He's saying here, look, don't be shocked or surprised when this happens. Don't think it's strange. In other words, 1 Peter 4:12 should set our expectations. I mean, think about this. Jesus was crucified. The symbol of Christianity is a cross. And it would be strange for us to expect that we're going to go through this life unscathed. So the first thing Peter says we need is just a good dose of realism. Don't be shocked or surprised or think it's strange when this happens. We're contrary to this world and to what it believes and how it lives. And so we're gonna get some blowback from that as Christians. The second thing here is to rejoice. Now that sounds kind of strange. But he says in verse 13, "But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that at the revelation of his glory you might rejoice with exultation. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you." Now, I don't think he's saying here that we're to rejoice that we suffer or that we're to enjoy the suffering. But what he's saying here is that you and I can look ahead to the coming of Jesus Christ and what God is going to do for us. And we can also have a greater sense of God's presence in our lives. There's a heightened sense of God's presence whenever we're being opposed and being persecuted by our culture. It's the promised presence of God in a unique way. Notice verse 14, he says, "The Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you." Now, we always have the Spirit of God in our lives, but I think he's saying here, in these times, in a unique way, the Spirit of God rests upon you in a powerful way. You'll sense God's presence. And the third thing he tells us to do here is reevaluate. Reevaluate your life. In verse 15, he says, by no means let any of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, or an evildoer, a troublesome meddler. He's saying here, look, reevaluate and make sure when you're suffering, you're not suffering for your own faults and your own foolishness. Sometimes we suffer and we think it's all because I'm such a wonderful Christian, but it's really because of our own foolishness, because of faults in our lives. And he's saying here, don't suffer as a murderer, we all know what that is, or a thief, or an evildoer, or as a troublesome meddler. That's the only time that word is used in the New Testament, and it means someone that stirs things up or an agitator. A lot of people in our culture today who are Christians are going out and agitating and stirring up trouble in the culture. We need to have courage. We need to stand for the truth, but we need to be prudent and be proportionate in how we respond. So we need to reevaluate and make sure we're not suffering for our own faults or foolishness. And then the final thing here in verse 19 is reliance. So we're to have a sense of realism, we're to rejoice, we're to reevaluate. But he says in verse 19, let those who suffer according to the will of God entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. Final thing he says is, look, just rely upon God and trust your soul to Him. That's a banking term in the New Testament. It means to put something somewhere for safekeeping. It says, take your soul, take your life, and entrust it to God. Entrust it to Him for His safekeeping. Deposit yourself into God's safekeeping, into His sovereign hands. So look, as we see increasing hostility in our culture against us as God's people, here are 4 very practical things you and I can do. We need a sense of realism. Don't be shocked and surprised this is happening. Don't think it's strange. It's part of what happens as a Christian. It's par for the course as a believer. Rejoice. Rejoice in the prospect that God has for us in the future and of His heightened presence in your life. Reevaluate. Make sure you're not suffering for your own faults and foolishness. And then put yourself into God's hands, into His safekeeping, into the hands of a faithful Creator. I hope that'll help you in these times in which we live. They're interesting times. They're difficult times. But you and I can stand firm if we'll do these things that God tells us to do when we're facing these times of trouble, these winds of change that have come upon our culture. Well, God bless you. Thank you for joining us. I hope to see you next time.